let's go back to your grandfathers and grandmothers.
Okay?
Were you around when they were still living?
Yes, some of them. Three of them. Three of the four.
Okay. So were they involved in farming then?
Yes.
Could you give me a little bit of an overview?
Sure, I'll talk about different ones. My mother's parents were Strombergs, and they had a farm off of Marriottsville, between Marriottsville and Henryton Road. And actually, by the time I knew them, they were not farming any longer, but just was sort of into the huge gardens kind of thing. But they had a farm. They used to say that my grandmother Stromberg would work all day and would have worked herself to death and kept going at things.
What was that farm like? Do you know?
The farm the house on the farm burned down before I was born, so I don't really know that much about that farming operation. But they had been farmers, and then my grandfather Stromberg's father, he grew up in one of that gatehouse out by DeRegan Manor, and the DeRegan Manor, his father was a gardener at DeRegan Manor and worked there and did farming there. Sure.
We're going to get this special design door jam in place so the door doesn't rattle while you're talking.
Okay.
We're on the hill.
Sounds like in the middle of it we took in some fire, enemy flak.
So we were going down the concept of, well, not
Of the
concept,
grandparents,
but the
yeah.
various different grandparents.
Right.
Go ahead.
And so that was the Stromberg side, and Granddaddy Stromberg kept this humongous garden forever. He married my step-grandmother was Florence Howard Stromberg, who lived over on Roxbury Mill Road. And so they were always involved with farming, but he was not doing it. Then my grandmother Jones was the one, that's where our farm was inherited from, that still has been in the family for my great nieces and nephews are the 10th generation. And I actually think you talked to my brother Phil too, so he probably told you all this already. But my grandmother Jones lived in the old house there, and she was a fascinating character. And someday I'll do a book about her. But
What do you mean she was a fascinating character?
well, by the time I knew her, she just sort of lived in the old house, and she had Vogue magazines that she got every time to see what the latest fashion was. But the house had no running water, no electricity. She had all her meals carried down to her and had enough electricity to run a light and a radio. So she'd had a light by her bed and she had a radio running. But there was no central heat, there was no anything like that. But she just lived like she was a queen. And when I looked at her life, she had grown up on that farm. And then she'd married my grandfather, was from Buffalo, New York. And if you look up her name on the internet, she was buying buildings in Manhattan for like $250,000, $300,000 in like 1914, 1910, whatever time frame it was. And that was my grandfather Jones, that was her husband, was sort of a speculator in that thing. And she always said he'd been murdered. And I have a great headline from the Buffalo paper that said his name was Lodowick Holmes Jones, L.H. Jones, not murdered. Which is an interesting, so that's why I say she was a character. She lived there, she loved the farm, she'd always talk about how it had been from her relatives and, how perfect that land was.
What was the source of electricity?
The source of electricity?
You said she had a little bit of it.
Well, she just had one wire coming in, like one. Now, the story was on the electricity, but the story was that Betty Dorsey, who lived next to us, told me that Dad did not want to get electricity because he wasn't sure that it would catch on. He wasn't sure it would be much good. And she moved in, and she had always cooked. She'd always had electric stoves. And she could not get cooking on the wood stove, and she was a young bride married to Pete Dorsey. And supposedly she came over and cried because they needed so many people down the road before they'd put the electricity back there. And that's when Dad agreed to run the electricity back.
What time frame was that?
Oh, that would have been, how old Sue? 19, yeah. I have to think on this a second. Probably in the late 30s, early 40s.
So Grandma Jones
Okay.
was living by herself there in that house?
Yeah, she lived by herself all the time I knew her.
I mean, she lost her husband.
Yeah, my grandfather died. He was the one that was not murdered. That was her husband that was not murdered.
So she sounds like, if you don't mind me saying, a pretty darn strong woman.
Well, she was, but she was also, you know, she pretty much kept to herself, and somehow she had my mom carried her down 3 meals a day as long as I knew her, and seems like a good life. I'm not sure how she got that done.
Did you spend much time down at her place?
All the time, all the time. Because my brothers were older when I was born. We were back on the farm, and I pretty much spent, she was my best friend, you know, growing up. We were
So
just like
when
that.
you went to the farm, what did you do?
When I mean, I lived at the farm, you know, I was there, and
What ages are we talking about now?
well, I lived there all my life. So,
Okay.
you know, from 1954 on, I was there.
Okay.
And my parents had built a house right next to hers, right when my brothers were born, with 2 bedrooms, one for my brothers and one for my parents. I was not anticipated, shall we say.
So let's count the siblings. It was you and,
My brother Phil and my brother John.
gotcha.
And they were 14 and 18. John graduated, to tie all this in of what you're doing, my brother John graduated the same week that they graduated from high school, and Jack O'Mara was in his class. And Jack always says he remembers my birthday because of that. So they were graduating from Howard High then.
What kind of things did you like to do on the farm?
Oh, you know, when,
Let's stay with you being young right now.
Yeah.
Since you spent your whole life there.
Right,
Let's just talk
yeah.
about being young.
when I was young, it was just, you know, run down, play in the streams, play Pioneer. You know, that was a big thing for some reason, play Pioneer, run down there.
What is Pioneer?
I don't know, just play you were a pioneer, just, you know, just
Oh,
always, you know, like you were gonna
making
making believe we were, you know, out on the prairie and, you know, building houses, and we had the streams we'd have to ford, and, you know, that was a big thing to play. I can remember you know, stupid, the little things you remember, but, you know, this was another time, but I had a turtle that I thought I was in love with, and I'd take it, go swimming every day. I don't know why. We'd take it down to the stream, and surprisingly enough, one day it disappeared, you know, which isn't exactly a shock. And cats, kittens, you know, barn cats, always playing with them. Just normal kid stuff.
Did you have any desire then to help out on the farm, chores-wise?
Well, you know, that happened a little late, you know, when I was real little, you know. I've thought about the first time that I did anything on the farm, and that I remember that was actually worth doing anything. And I can remember because, again, my brothers were older, and they had the kick baler. And when you had the kick baler, they'd have to pick up the bales after it went out, and you'd pick it up and you'd put it on the wagon. And I could not possibly have reached the pedals, I know that. And they'd just have me sort of holding on, and, you know, the tractors did not have power steering. And I would be sitting there holding on. And then at the end of the row, they'd hop on and turn the tractor the other way because I wasn't strong enough to do that. But I guess I was better than nothing in terms of keeping it sort of headed in the right direction. And I thought about that's sort of the first thing I remember actually doing on the farm.
Who was the patriarch on the farm then?
That was my dad. My dad was Ridgely Jones, and he had a tremendous amount of energy. He did a lot.
Were you able to learn farming from him?
Well, I was a girl, and so girls weren't real, and I had 2 older brothers, so I was kind of superfluous on that front. You know, it was like you didn't really need anybody. You know, they already had the 2 sons, and I did a fair amount, but I was never, there was no track by which it was thought that I would take over the farm. That was going to be my brothers, and I was supposed to do something else.
What does a fair amount mean?
Well, you know, I did, you know, fed calves, you know, my dad, as I got into high school, the later I came in, the more disgusting and earlier the task would be the next day. And that was in high school and in college. So it wasn't uncommon for me to go out on a day about like this, only have it be hotter and a windy day, and they'd have to disc or something. He'd put me on a disc on some far out field where I couldn't come back for hours and hours if I'd come back late. So, you know, I could rake hay and I could bale hay and, you know, just general, but it was more, and I milked, you know, I never, but I don't want to make it sound like I was like essential to the operation, because it was my brothers were doing more of it. But as you know, when it gets busy on a farm, everybody does something. I've pulled calves, you know, just general.
That still sounds pretty busy, Ann.
Well, you know, it was before school, it was after school, it was, you know. When I went to Glenelg, which was probably a little later than a lot of the people you're talking to, but there were still 3 or 4 people when it was cold. You'd go in, and the reason they were late was because the hose froze in the calf barn. I don't think you'll see that over there that much anymore, but there would be at least 3 or 4 people that were late. You know, they all had we had a herringbone from the time I can remember it put in. So, you know, you'd go in there, and of course you only milk by hand to strip them off at the beginning. But
That's a new term for me. Can you describe what herringbone means?
herringbone is it's I like it, they call it an H because it looks sort of like an H, I guess you'd say, but you go into a pit in the middle and cows come in each side. So you're standing like eye level with the udder so that it makes it a lot easier. You're not bending down to milk or whatever. And one side comes in and you wash them, and then you put the milkers on them. Then the other side comes in, you wash them while the other side's milking. And then so you can go back and forth between the 2 sides easily. And it saves a lot of time because it's not like you're washing them and then milking them and then sending them out.
What was the herd size? Do you have any idea?
At that time, it's probably around, probably around 80. It's always been around 80 to 120, ever since I can remember.
So at that time, there was your 2 brothers.
My 2 brothers,
your
my dad, yeah.
Any farm hands?
Not on a permanent basis. They would hire people in the summer to help out. A lot of the O'Mara boys, they came out from time to time in the summer.
Did you ever hear stories about prisoners?
Yes, but different from the ones that I've heard from what you all talked about with the German prisoners of war and stuff. And Dad used to like to go up and just pick up hitchhikers that were coming from, I guess it was the prison in Hagerstown, that they'd get released. And he knew the day of the week when they got released, because there was a day of the week when they'd release them. And this was real prisoners. But they were on their way to Baltimore. And he'd go up, if they were hitchhiking up by Frederick, because that's where the roads would spin off. A lot of them had hitched as far as Frederick. He'd go up and he'd get a haying crew, he always said, by telling them, I'll give you a day's work, and then I'll take you into Baltimore at the end of the day, and I'll pay you and feed you for the day. And a lot of them would do it, and he really hated when the hippie generation started and people were just hitchhiking for no reason. He thought that was ridiculous. But he had one guy that he did this with that stayed and ended up buying a farm up in Pennsylvania. And the guy stayed, came back, and worked for Dad for years and years. So, but pardon me, I never heard the stories about the POWs being used there. They may have, but I never heard. I mean, I've read it from Howard County stuff, but I didn't hear it on our farm.
How did your dad know of prisoners that were released? By telephone or what?
No, I mean, I think there was a day of the week when they always released them. And he would go up, or maybe it was every day. I just know that he went up and picked him up at Frederick and said he'd give him a good meal and a day's work.
Never heard that. That's really
Yeah.
interesting.
I don't know. That's
That
what he
went on-
said.
That went on for a while?
Yeah, I mean, that's how he did things for probably until John and Phil got old enough to really be the crews. So
What can you remember them doing when they got to the farm?
I don't remember. I mean, I just remember them being around and haying and doing the normal. I don't have any specific.
And corn?
Oh yeah, there was corn, but by the time I was there, but the haying was always a bigger deal than the corn somehow. That maybe because it happened more frequently. I don't know.
Yeah,
should
corn
make
was
hay.
once a year and hay
Hay's
is 3 or 4.
3 or 4 times, yeah, 4 in a good year. So that was always a bigger deal.
I want to get a description of this farm, how it was laid out.
Sure, it's still there. It's about 340 some acres. It's a dairy farm and has been since I've known it, but it would have been, my great-grandfather would have been raising horses. He raised work horses. And we have some old letters that even go back to, there was tobacco at one time on the farm going back. It's pretty much the farmstead is pretty much all together in one place. There's the old house that my grandmother it was built in 1880, and that's where she lived, and it's pretty much fallen down now, but that's there. There was the rancher that my parents built before I was born, and then a bank barn. When I was little, there was still a horse barn that got torn down, and then just all the normal sheds that have been built on around the dairy barn. You can always, my kids asked me one time how I knew when I went into something that it was a dairy farm, and you can tell. You look at it, you can see where it's like here, you can see where the dairy was, you can see where the milk house was, you can see how the farms were laid out. So,
Did you have chickens?
I did not. My mother did, and by the time I came along, there were only a few of them left. But Mom had raised chickens for her pin money and took them down to Sykesville to sell for a right good while, but they were done with that.
What is pin money?
Pin money was the old expression they used to use, and supposedly what it was a little money you'd pin to yourself when you went out to make sure that you had money to get home with. And that's what she always called it, her pin money. So just a little bit to spend, just a little bit to have.
So the majority of the income during those days for the farm is coming
From milk.
and the milk was leaving the farm how?
Well, not when I remember it, but when Dad, when they talked about it, they still had milk cans and they'd take it out to the corner at 32 and get picked up there. They'd milk, put it in the spring house to cool, and then take it there. By the time I was there, there were milk trucks coming in, picking it up. And I guess somewhat amusing milk truck story is, there were still a lot of dairy farmers when I grew up going back the road. There aren't many now. But the most important thing when it snows is to get the milk out of there, because you got to dump the milk. If you can't get it out, you lose several days' income. So even though every couple people shipped to different cooperatives and shipped to different locations, that all kind of went away when the snow came in, and you just filled the truck up with whatever came in. And so everybody would go out in their tractors, and we used to have the Rhines and the Dorseys and the Pipeses and the Wellings and the Joneses were all shipping milk back that road. And everybody would get in their tractors and just make sure, they'd open that road up no matter what to get that milk truck into each place. And I remember we had a woman that had moved in across the place, and it must have looked crazy to her because she wasn't a farmer. And all of a sudden there's this huge parade of tractors going down the road. And then they come back, with the milk truck behind them. And then we turn around to take them into another place. So I was really just along to get out of the house. I wasn't doing any good. I was just driving a tractor at the end of it just to be out doing something. And she called me over because I was back, and she says, "What's going on here?" And I started telling her, and she looks at me and says, "You're a girl." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." She said, "You're on a tractor. What are you doing on a tractor?" Out in the middle of the snowstorm. But so that was.
Along the same lines, though, the tractors had to open up the roadways for the milk trucks to get in.
Right.
And out. But then when it was only milk cans, you still had to open up the roads to get the cans.
Yeah, I'm sure they did. Yep. Like I say, they were gone by the time I was there.
What was your first tractor you got to drive?
Oh, gracious. Dad had all the M's, all the Farmall M's, and that was the first thing I drove, definitely.
You have anything green?
We had a couple, but not that many. He wasn't a big John Deere. We had International Harvesters, we had M's. I guess they got some Deeres more recently, but he had some Minneapolis Moleens. Used to drive them.
And so it was how was the learning of the tractor process? Can you tell me how that?
Oh, geez. I don't even remember how I learned how to drive a tractor. The tractor just happened. I do remember a whole lot of instructions when I was driving the baler for the first time. And it was a kick baler that I sort of misspoke about the kick balers, because the early balers weren't really kick balers, because the kick balers went into the wagon. The early balers just put them out on the ground. But Dad had more instructions on the kick baler and how to do it and when to do it. And they were nice to me too, by the way. Because I used to feed the calves, they would run, because you can adjust the knots on the baler to make the bales smaller. So they would do some like 30, 40-pound bales for me. They'd make them smaller and they'd put them all in the calf barn so that I didn't pick up the bigger bales. They were always, true gentlemen out at the farm.
You were using the tractor to pull the bale.
Yeah, but on the kick bale, this was just how they do it. But when they started teaching me how to drive the kick baler, Dad told me in mind-numbing detail how to do everything in it, including if I took a turn to make sure that I didn't kick the bale out when a car was coming. Now, I've never heard of anybody getting hit by a bale when somebody does that, so I said that was a little bit too much instruction at that point, because I was worried enough taking up this big piece of equipment, I might do something wrong, and then I'm like, and if I go around the corner too fast and there's a car coming, I'll throw a bale onto him, which I don't think could even happen, but so be it.
Did you have any red tractors that were smaller than the M? That's a pretty big tractor.
I don't think so. We didn't have any of those real little ones. I don't remember it.
What else did you hook on the back of that tractor?
Oh, pretty much anything. Yeah, but you know, you like I say, the rake, the disc. I never really plowed very much. I'm not sure why. I don't know whether it was the timing or and they never hardly let me plant. I mean, these could all be hooked on them, but planting you had to do just right, and you know, it was always a point of pride to plant. You know, and so I didn't plant, but you know, like I say, discs, harrows, balers. Trying to think of what else. Corn planters,
And these,
manure spreaders.
the farm all end tractors had side sickle bars on them or something else?
Yeah, no, that had a side sickle bar on it. You're going to get into it.
Whatever.
See, what I hated about equipment, I'll tell you what the worst thing of being there was. Once I got my driver's license, of course, I was in charge of whenever equipment broke down, going and getting the equipment fixed. And what Dad would tend to do is hand me a part and say, take this up to Duval's or wherever the hell we were going. Take this up and get one of these. Well, I didn't know what one of these was. They'll know what it is.
Well, if it has a number on it, then,
So I'd take it up, and inevitably they'd ask some question like, you know, is the PTO shaft this, that, or the other, or something like what you just said that I didn't know the answer to. And of course, this was before cell phones. And then they just look at me like I was stupid. Here's this 16-year-old girl standing in wherever it is waiting for a part. And they'd have to call Mom at home. Mom would have to go get Dad out of the field. Dad would have to come in and talk to them to find out what the question was. And then I'd always be yelled at when I got home. Why did you not know that about it? So.
well, then he had to go back out the field and get the cereal number.
Exactly, and then it would all be a mess. That, I always said I never liked mechanics and farms because my memories were that, and the other thing is, when something broke down, you know, in the middle of harvest or whatever, and you gotta get it fixed, they'd put me out with a flashlight once I could read, to read the instructions. And of course, then it wouldn't work. And then they'd yell, are you sure that's what it said? And I'm like, yeah, it says to do this, that, and the other. And so most things associated with fixing equipment, I still like probably think of as just getting yelled at, you know.
So, tell me a time when you were doing that reading again. Give me a little more context about that experience.
Well, it's whenever you could read. So, you know, I probably third grade when you could read third, fourth grade when you could read, you know, and sit there with a flashlight. And I vividly remember doing that a fair amount because
Is that the operator's manual?
I don't know what I was reading, whatever they told me to read. I guess it was the operator's manual, something about how to fix something.
Did Dad
You know.
read?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But not, you know, they were working on it. They wanted somebody to sit there with a light so they didn't have to jump up and down every 10 minutes.
Right.
And you know.
So you spent many a night near this equipment with a flashlight in your hand.
Yeah, getting yelled at because I'm sorry that Part A doesn't go into Part B like it's supposed to. It says here it is. Maybe you're not on Part A or B, you know, but.
Great. That's a great experience. But you'd rather drive the equipment or use it than to read about it, huh?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Driving it was just, you know, I never minded doing that.
How many years did you operate this equipment?
Well, all through college, and then once I graduated from college, I moved away from the farm, and I haven't done that much of it since then.
Where'd you go to college?
Western Maryland up in Westminster. Well, it's called McDaniel now.
Right. And what did you study?
Political science.
Okay, that's close to farming.
Yeah.
It's a science.
I'm all about land preservation, and I've always been. From that, I got into that. So.
Oh, okay. So, before that, when you were young, the earliest stages of farming for you were in your preteens, or were you even earlier than that you were helping?
Well, preteen is everything before you're a teenager. You know, I would say probably, I don't know, 8 or 9, somewhere
Okay.
around there, doing
Okay.
stuff
So
that was of any good, you know.
And that's important. So your typical day at 8 or 9 or 10 was what? Can you describe to me how that worked?
Well, I mean, typically, I had to be honest, typically I got to do what I wanted to do. I did these things that I'm talking about doing when I was 8 or 9 or 10 was when they needed it. And your typical day was if Dad said, come do something, you went to do something. There wasn't a whole lot of back and forth about that. But that was not, I don't want to make it sound like I spent every day doing that, because I didn't. But there were definitely times when they needed help, and it was normally planting and harvesting were the 2 times when they really needed it.
What you're saying is he saw you getting curious and he decided to make use of that curiousness.
That would be a kind way of, he just saw me getting able to reach the pedals, and it was time to use the pedal. I don't think I was all that curious. I did sit on a cow one time when she was having a calf. That's when I was very little. I don't know how that cow was that gentle, but I came back up and I had told Mom the whole story. I couldn't have been over 3 or 4 then. It was a cow named Queenie that they showed out at the fair, so she was kind of a pet cow and everybody taking care of her. And I came back in great graphic detail, told Mother exactly how the birth was, including the fact that the cow had like felt tense and then not tense and tense and not tense. She says, "Where were you?" I said, "I was sitting on her." And she thought I was encouraged not to do that again.
How old were you?
I don't know, 4 or 5, something like that.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, a bigger kid wouldn't have been able to sit on the couch. She would have knocked you off,
Wow. Still staying in this age group, what was a typical Sunday like?
I hated Sundays. I hated Sundays because everybody slept on Sundays. And I was enough younger than them that I wanted to do stuff. And I was so bored because everybody didn't do anything on Sundays. And we didn't have big family dinners. Well, occasionally we would, but that wasn't like a tradition in our house, We might go to church. Again, it wasn't totally regular, but, we'd go to church, I don't know, a fair amount. But the main thing of me was Sunday afternoon, I can just remember being so bored because everybody would be asleep. And they all took naps on Sunday afternoon, and I did not like that.
Was that because you had a big Sunday dinner or what?
No, it was just because it was the only time, somehow that was okay. That was the time when they didn't have to work and they just slept. Not a normal reaction, but
So what did you do for fun on Sunday?
Oh, I'd go, just play outside, go someplace. And
Did you have a bicycle?
Oh, yeah.
Did all the boys have bicycles?
I assume they did, but they were done with them by the time I was there. I mean, I had the bicycle, but again, Mom didn't let me ride that many places. I'd ride around the farm, but there wasn't anybody close that was close to the Dorseys were the closest that were my age. The Dorseys had 9 kids, but they were busy taking care of 9 kids, and getting there you had to run, go all around Underwood and up Old Frederick, and she didn't like me going that far on the bike by myself.
You didn't associate with them that much?
No, I mean, I would go over, but see, that was mainly, they had 7 boys and 2 girls, so it was more boys than girls. And it wasn't that I didn't like them.
You could have rough and tumbled with them.
Well, I did some. Sue used to take us to swimming lessons over at Kramer's Pool, where, of course, everybody went, and she'd put us all in that car, and she's the oldest. She'd throw us all in the car, and I remember one time I was sitting on the edge, and she says, "Go around a corner, you got to hold on because that door goes open." She says to me, it flies open, so I had to hold it. It was a Comet station wagon that they had. So.
So you did develop some best friends?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell me about your best friends?
Well, my best friends it was mainly when I got to elementary school that I really, made friends. And most of them were farmers, and most of them were dairy farmers. A good friend that I'm still in touch with is Marion Thompson. Her dad was Harvey Thompson, and they owned kind of the farms where the dump is now. Well, they and the O'Mearas and it's all that area where the landfill is, and also where 70 came through. And that came through when I was in 7th grade. And we didn't want that to happen, and we didn't, because she moved because of that. So her brother and us, we used to go out on the weekend and pull up all the stakes for where the road was going to go. And we thought we could stop it by pulling up all those. We didn't, but and Pam Justice was still a good friend of mine, and her dad was also a dairy farmer at that point in time. I had a lot of good friends in elementary school, and they were friends on my road. I don't mean to sound like we didn't have them, but it wasn't the kind of thing where you ran back and forth and saw each other that much.
How were you getting to school when you were little?
A school bus.
Just
At the end of the lane, yeah. Oh, well, I mean, it was, at that point, the elementary schools, the high schools, and the middle schools all rode the same bus. So, which had its good points and its bad points, because there were always some high school girls that took care of the little kids. And then there were some high school boys that were a little rough, and so it was all. But so I went to West Friendship, and we'd go there first, and then I guess they went to, I don't even know where they went, to the middle school at that point, but then they went to Glenville High School after that, the bus did. They weren't separate for the 3 things.
Did you have a favorite piece of equipment that you used?
Well, not of the scale that the Antique Farm Machinery Club. The best thing that happened that I loved is when he got a Snapper lawnmower and I could drive that because it did such short turns and I could go really fast. But that's probably not on the scale that y'all would be interested in out here.
Doesn't
But
matter.
I remember when we got that, I thought I was in heaven.
You were about what age then?
Oh, gosh. Probably 8th or 9th grade when they got that, something like that.
Had there been any injuries on the farm?
Well, not terrible bad ones, but there is a funny story, if you want a funny story about one. Dad and chainsaws didn't get along very well, and he had his share of chainsaw injuries. And one of them that I vividly remember, I was down at the barn feeding calves, and I was probably 16 or 17 because I was definitely driving. And he came up and he'd cut his hand. He was cutting on a wagon, and he'd cut his hand with a chainsaw. And he came walking in, and he's yelling, Ann, hurry up. And so they wrapped it up in an old towel and put him in the car. And Phil was in the back of the car, my brother was. And then somehow he hopped out to go get Dad's driver's license and stuff. I took off and kind of didn't even realize Phil wasn't in the car, so it was just me in the car. I'm driving him to Howard County Hospital, and at one point, Dad looks at me and says, I might die from this wound, but don't drive so fast that I die from that. But we go in, and we had to look like the Hatfield and McCoys, because we've all been down at the barn. We're dressed like this. We got blood all over the place. And it was one of the first times I've been to Howard County Hospital. I go in the front door, and the woman there just looks at us and goes, get back there, get back there. So, we don't want to look at you. So we go back, and they came out, and they said, well, it'll be about a half hour on the surgery on it. And then nothing happened, and I go in, and Dad said, well, I told him not to do anything with him because I told him I make my living with my hands. Well, that made it sound like he was a concert pianist. What he meant was he milked cows. But apparently they had looked at it, and one of the guys had said, I think that's a tendon, don't you? So he said, hold off. They brought in the specialist, and the specialist looked irked. I think he'd been, pulled off the golf course or whatever. And he looks at it, and he says, this is going to be 10 minutes. Well, hours go by. Now, I'm barefoot, I'm covered with cow manure, and I got no money with me, so I'm just sort of sitting there. This is, of course, again, no cell phones or anything. And finally, Mom came, one of my brothers brought her down to see what was going on. And the surgeon comes out, and he said, it's the most complicated hand surgery I've ever done. Everything was cut from here to there. It's going to take forever. It's this, that. It was filthy because it had all the sawdust in it and everything from the barn. He says, it's a good thing you called me in. So they go up to the room, they get Dad settled in, and sitting there in the room, and we're tired, we want to go home, but he hasn't come to yet, is Harvey Noyes. And I don't know if you knew Harvey Noyes or remember that. Harvey was one of the guys, he'd grown up on the farm behind us. And Harvey was one of the guys that had been in that terrible accident where like 4 people were killed. They were coming back from an Orioles game, and they flipped off a 29 onto 40. And there were 5 of them in the car, 4 of them were killed. And Harvey, they didn't think would make him, and they took him to Howard County Hospitals when it had sort of first opened, just thinking, well, they'll probably pronounce him there. Well, they pulled him through. And so he was back for one of his many operations that, when you have something terrible like that happen, will happen. So Harvey Noyes was there, so we thought, oh, this is great. Harvey's here, and we looked at, Mom said, Harvey, will you please tell us when Mr. Jones wakes up, give us a call, and, let us tell him we're thinking about him. But we're tired, we want to go home, he seems to be stable, everything's fine. Harvey said, of course we will. So the next day we go back, and Dad's there, and I said, Dad, wasn't it good that Harvey was here? And Dad looks up, he says, well, it's pretty weird. I said, well, why is that? He says, well, I woke up, and here was a bright light, and Harvey Noyes standing in front of it, and all I could think was, did Harvey live or die in that accident? And he says, and I know that's not something you ask somebody, Are you dead or alive? So that was probably we were pretty lucky on accidents, but he did have a number of chainsaw incidents.
How about yourself?
Yeah, well, stepping on nails and stuff like that, but nothing major.
Did you have a large woods and
Yeah, there's a lot of wood land on it.
chainsaws were used in the woods?
Yeah.
Did you cut trees down to make lumber or anything?
No, they never cut it down to make lumber. They would just cut it for firewood. Like I say, Grandma didn't ever have central heat, so there was firewood in there all the time. And Dad would just go back to cull some trees or thin out some things.
Do you remember any thunderstorms and any destruction that ever did?
Yeah, well, we had a tornado there when I was in college. Tornado hit down there, and the little guy from the National Weather Service came out and kept saying, we didn't predict tornadoes, we didn't predict them. But we were really lucky. It went through, it took a whole bunch of trees, but it managed to take a path that just avoided, like it took the corner light and some of the corner shingles off of Mom and Dad's house and did that kind of thing, but luckily it didn't hit any of the major buildings in the path.
Had any fires there?
Not there that I remember. Like I say, my grandparents over the other place did, but not us.
Grandparents, was that a major fire or just?
It
small?
burned their house down.
Burned
Yeah,
the house.
burned the house down.
I'd call that
Yeah.
major.
And that's when they sold that farm and moved to a little place over on Rogers Avenue.
What was the size of that farm?
Their farm was a couple 100 acres, but apparently it was very hilly, and it's now state park land. It's been bought by the park people going down to the Patapsco River there.
So primarily, even though you described such incredible involvement in the farm and your dad, it was really your dad and your two brothers
Yes.
that did the majority of the operating of the farm?
Right. And I don't, like I say, I don't want to say they didn't do that. They were the ones that did most of it, you know.
What was your mom doing during that period?
Well, Mom was not the farm lady that was out doing the farm thing. She was very active. She was, you know, head of the Historical Society. She was always involved in PTAs. She did that kind of thing. But she was not, and she had raised chickens, like I said, before I kind of started there. And Dad said she milked cows when she was younger. But by the time I came along, she didn't milk cows or do chickens. She was pretty much an insight. And I pretty much knew, you know, once it's absolutely true in life, once you learn how to do anything, you have to do it for the rest of your life. So I kind of didn't want to learn how to do the cooking and the indoor stuff, and I did do more of the outside stuff because it was just more fun.
Did she do any canning or gardening?
A little bit of canning, but not much. But what she was like, and again, it was like once you could buy it in the store, why would you go through all that hassle? That was kind of her, you know.
Yeah, there were times when there weren't any stores and stuff.
Yep.
You did
Yeah.
have to preserve
Right.
and can, cold pack it.
Yeah, back then. But she was, and she hated butchering. She would talk about, I never knew her to butcher, but she talked about how much she hated everything to do with butchering. It was just not her thing.
Did you help Dad with that?
They didn't ever butcher when I was around. She just still talked about how much she hated it.
So you're moving forward in time now.
Okay,
You're finished high school.
mm-hmm,
You went off to college.
right.
What was going on with the farm during that period?
Well, still dairy farm, still my brother's farming. They actually bought another farm. They participated in the land preservation program, which, like I say, I do that. They sold their development rights back in the 80s.
Well, tell me about, you said they bought another farm.
Yeah, they bought a farm down the Underwood farm. My brothers bought it to expand the operation.
Still with your dad living?
Yes, but my two brothers bought it
Separate
Yeah.
from your dad?
separate from Dad, yeah.
And so was there a tri-operation, two brothers and dad going on with the farms? Was there a collective set of equipment operating?
Oh, yeah. No, they're all, yeah, it's just down the road. It's just another, they just crop that one mainly.
Adjacent to?
Not immediately, but very close.
A farm in between, or?
Actually, at one point, there's only about not much wider than this building between, but you have to go around the Underwood Road to get there. So it's maybe 3/4 of a mile that you have to take equipment.
And how big was the second farm?
About 80 acres.
And what was the advantage to that with your dads and your brothers both having farms?
Well, they just wanted to have their own farm. You know, they wanted to have their own land.
Yeah, but if they planted and got hay off of it, that's
Yeah.
profit, right?
Right, yeah. And I mean, for a long time, ever since I've known the farm's been incorporated. We have separate ownerships, which is not uncommon, you know, in farms. So the land's in one ownership, and then the farm business, which actually owns the second farm, is all the equipment, the cows, and that kind of thing. So there's a couple of different corporations there.
But they all work together to make that land, give them prosper.
Right, they all were,
process
yes.
of making money off of it.
Yep.
Okay.
They grow most of their own feed for the cows, so.
On the other 80.
Well, on everything, because of on the home farm and the other one. The other one's just cropped though.
And what are some of the crops?
Well, you know, we're slow because it even took them a long time to pick up soybeans, but it's pretty much alfalfa, corn, soybeans, a little bit of barley,
We're
a little bit of winter
about-
wheat.
We're talking about this season?
Well, yeah, for as long as I can remember, they
Oh,
haven't really
pretty
changed much. Now, I didn't realize back in the, when would it have been? Back in the 20s, 30s, the farm was almost all tomatoes at one point, which I never knew until I was talking to my brother a while ago. And that was before my dad. My dad bought a second, this had all originally been in the family, but he had one piece and there was a piece in the back that he bought, and the piece in the back had gone to one of his cousins. And the cousin had that whole place in tomatoes. But it was unfortunately one of these things where they put it in tomatoes and they'd pinned a lot of hopes on him really becoming the farmer and making a go of it. But they didn't anticipate, I guess it was earlier than I guess it was the 20s, they didn't anticipate what would happen when California came on board and refrigeration came on board. And then there were a couple of bad years and he lost the farm basically. And then Dad bought that farm too, during the Depression.
You have places like Woodbine and Sykesville, they had canneries
I know.
all along that
I know.
railroad track.
Yeah,
I'm sure that's where the tomatoes went.
probably. But that was his thing, he was gonna build and I never knew it had all been in tomatoes.
You never worked at that?
No, I didn't know that one. That was long before I wandered around.
And so, what was the situation when your dad was passing away? What was the farm like? What was the situation with what was that?
I mean, it was still an active dairy farm and, you know, he worked up until almost the end. And there's always been, you know, our goal and the family's goal has always been to keep the land. And that's what we work on. The land is tremendously important to us. And I can remember growing up, Mom had a set of the IRS code about estate planning, which is not a normal thing you see in a farm, you know, at a farmhouse. But, you know, every time, you know, the asset is very valuable, but the income off of it is not very great. And so when you get to an inheritance tax or estate tax point, that's always a point of concern. And we've managed to keep it so far, Repwood, so hopefully we'll be able to pass it when Phil and I, who are joint owners, when it goes on, hopefully we'll get it to the next generation.
Go ahead, Ed. Do you have a question?
What did you do for entertainment back then? Anybody play musical instruments? Did you have a parlor?
They did not do music. Mom and Dad were ballroom dancers, and they would go in. Like I say, Dad had incredible energy. And Mother would always say she did not have as much energy as Dad did. And he would come in after milking on a Saturday night or after something, let's go in dancing. And they'd go into Baltimore, they'd go into the Famous, they'd go into different places and go ballroom dancing. And then every once in a while, and this is as the boys got older, they'd say, let's go up to New York for the weekend. And they'd go up and watch New York Broadway shows. And he'd take the train from Baltimore up and see a show and come back. And, you know, they'd have parties and, you know, the old Farm Bureau discussion group would come in and, you know, they were always involved in local politics and local, you know, zoning issues and that kind of thing for the time I could do it.
Do you remember anything about the streetcar in Ellicott City or going to Ellicott City to buy anything or going to any of the businesses?
I don't remember going to Ellicott City and I don't remember the streetcar, but the streetcar played a big part in Mom and Dad's life. And one of them was when Dad came back to the farm, because like I say, his father was from Buffalo, was not murdered, and then they came back. He was living with one of his aunts in Roland Park, and he loved the farm. And this was his grandfather's farm, and he'd come out and he wanted to come to the farm. And the story that he swore was true was that at the age of 9, he took the streetcar with his bicycle from Roland Park to Ellicott City, rode the bicycle from Ellicott City out to the farm, and said, I'm not leaving. And he didn't. He's buried there. We have a burial farm a burial place on the farm. So that was always, yeah.
Did you ever go to movies in Ellicott City?
couple times, but not that. Not that many.
So where did you buy your clothes and, well, I guess there were shopping centers around in your time.
In my time, there were shopping centers. Now, the food, we still got it, we pretty much went into Sykesville, to Harris's if you wanted to get food. I remember when they opened up the Normandy Shopping Center with the Safeway there, and that was a big deal. And I'm not sure when that happened, but then we started going there. And clothes, we'd go into Hutzler's.
And Hustlers was where?
Sometimes we went downtown and then we went to Westview. But
It was also Edmondson Village.
yeah, of course, Edmondson Village, where they had the monkeys in the front of the place where you bought your shoes. And Mother would never let me get my feet x-rayed because she didn't think that was normal, and she was probably right. And then we'd go, but she wouldn't drive in town. Mother didn't trust country doctors, so she wouldn't take me to the doctor out here, and she wouldn't drive in town because she was a terrible driver. She was a terrible, terrible, terrible driver. But she'd drive as far as Edmondson Village and take a cab in. And then we'd come back, and I can remember the Reed's drugstore there, and we'd get a milkshake at the counter there and everything. But that was sort of we were Baltimore-oriented, which is always the interesting thing to me about Howard County. You got Frederick-oriented, Washington-oriented, and Baltimore-oriented.
There was Reed's, there was Woolworths.
Yeah. And they used to go, before that, they always said they'd go into Montgomery Wards, but that was before my time, that the big deal was going into Montgomery Wards.
All right. Here's an odd question for you.
I'm an odd person, it'll work.
Have you ever been to the Howard County Fair?
Oh, God, yes. Maybe a couple times.
Well, that was a lead-in.
Okay.
Have you participated, shown, exhibited?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit.
We didn't do cows. I mainly did girly stuff. I used to go around at the fair, what can you say about the fair? I say it was like our front porch because we didn't have a town and you didn't have a front porch. So it was like, get a town for a week. And I would go around one year and I looked at all the exhibits for the 4-H, for the home arts and all the stuff in there. And I looked at ones where there weren't very many people that had exhibited. And the next year I did all those exhibits so I could win a bunch of ribbons and get a bunch of money. That was my, So I made all these things for how to babysit kids and stuff like that nobody else was doing. I loved the fair.
That's interesting. So if the last time you were at the fair and you were walking around the fairgrounds,
Yeah.
along comes another person up to you. It could be a guy, it could be a gal, and they say to you, I heard you were doing a lot of farming and you drove a lot of farm equipment and you were on your dad's farm. I'm thinking about getting into farming. Would you give me some advice on that?
Oh, gracious.
What would you tell them?
I don't think that I would. I think it's pretty presumptuous to give advice on that. I think you've got to. I feel very optimistic that there are a lot of young people going back into farming now, and I think that there's a lot of. I think the local food movement has a lot to do with that, and I think food security is going to continue. People, unfortunately, are afraid of everything that they're eating. And I think we're in an area with certainly a high net income here in Howard County. But if you don't love it, you shouldn't do it. Because even having said all that, it's not, I think one of the hardest things about farming in Howard County now is so many people that move in the county are so darn rich. And we have such a high income that I look at like my great nieces and nephews going to school with people that have, they're taking cruises over their breaks, they're going skiing in Colorado. They just have a different lifestyle. And so if you don't fundamentally like being outside and doing it, you aren't going to make that much money on it. And I'm not sure that's advice for, how to farm or anything. I would never give that, but just if they wanted to get into it.
How do you feel about the price of land in Howard County for someone who wants to farm?
That's obvious. It ain't gonna. It's if you haven't inherited it, it's just not. I would love, and it's not just Howard County. It's a lot of Maryland. I would really love to figure out some way to make more farms affordable to people who want to farm, but I'm not sure how to do it. The original thought when people went into easements was that it would lower the value so much, but it has not done that. They still retain tremendous after value in this area.
It was interesting, you said the word inherited because so many of our prior have said the same thing.
Yeah,
It needs to be a family.
it really does. There's no way to, and unfortunately, so many of the family farms are getting bought up by the people who are just hobbyists or have a couple horses, or there's a lawyer and a doctor or something moving in. And not that there's anything wrong with lawyers and doctors, but it goes out of that.
Who's farming in your family now?
My brother Phil and my nephew Tim are full-time farmers.
And their crops or their income producing is from,
Dairy and then the same alfalfa and corn and soybeans. Pretty boring.
Do you have a small cheese business?
They do. Mitzi's, I help, Tim's wife Mitzi got that started. And so they sell at the fair and they sell different places. They don't actually make the cheese there, which is partially because of they don't know how to make cheese, but they could learn that. But it's really because of the regulations are huge in Maryland. And you look at the cost of the equipment. So what they do is they take a tanker load about once or twice a month of our milk up to a guy in Pennsylvania who actually makes it into cheese, and then we bring it back here and sell it, which uses their expertise and their capital on the equipment, and I think makes a lot of sense for them. Milk prices go, I mean, you probably, they're very volatile. They change a lot. And
What is the youngest individual in the Jones family that could inherit the farm?
the youngest individual is Luke, who is in 5th grade at this point. But
Is he interested in farming?
we're not, that generation so far, not showing a whole lot, so we'll see.
He'd rather text message him.
Yeah, or rather text her. Or Tim and Mitzi's kids, Jacob is a big wrestler, their son. He's over at Glenelg now, and he'd rather do that kind of thing. So we'll see what happens.
and what are you doing these days?
I do land preservation work. I've been a private consultant for about 20 years now. I work doing, mainly in Baltimore County, doing conservation easements with farmers that want to preserve their land. I administer something called the Rural Legacy Program. And then I've worked at the state advocating for funding for these programs. So
And so briefly, you're interacting with landowners to keep their land?
right, you sell an easement and you keep your land, but you can't develop it in the future. So you can't put houses on it. You can keep 1 or 2 houses, but it's not going to go into development. And that's Maryland's at the forefront of that, really.
You've also done some good work for the Howard County Conservancy.
Yeah, I was president of the Howard County Conservancy for a while and worked with them there. And they've done, I think that turned out pretty well. I think Senator Clark would like that.
Great.
Yeah.
Can you think of anything else you'd like to add? Any unusual stories or?
Any notes you made on your?
Yeah, on the way over here. What should I talk about? I don't know. Because I remember, I don't think so. I just, it was great growing up there, and I wouldn't trade anything about it for anything. It was a great place to grow up, and it's you don't appreciate things when you're going through them, and I think that's just the way it is. But it is a freedom that you just, you don't have anymore. To just run and do what you want to when you're a kid.